Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Control Yourself podcast. I am Dr. Andreo Spina. For today's episode, we're actually playing a lecture that I gave back in 2020 during COVID. So it was an online lecture, and the lecture was given for the Royal College of Chiropractic Sports Sciences of Canada. The 2020 virtual conference that they put on was entitled MOVE, the psychological, biomechanics, and neurophysiological implications of human movement. I was asked to do a topic on human movement. The topic that I covered in the hour that I was given was entitled The Origins of Human Movement by Means of Natural Selection. If you have taken our courses, or if you've done the strength course specifically, you will notice that this particular lecture is a very shortened version of a much longer lecture that I give for the introduction of the FRS internal strength model course. In the lecture, I cover pretty much all the way back to the origins as to how human movements were created. And if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me say that a better understanding as to how movements are created allow us to better intervene, so to speak, when we're trying to change, alter, or improve human movement performance. So the lecture is a little over an hour, covers a multitude of topics, including the importance for afferents, the idea of the natural selection of human movement during fetal growth and during subsequent development. I go over the creation of space, how space is created in a joint, and how the joint is seen by the central nervous system, or how the body sees its own movements. I go over the original reasons for movements. I go over the ideas, incomplete ideas, as you'll see or listen to during the lecture, regarding things such as movement as medicine or movement being medicine, and various other topics. So again, this is taken from 2020 from the RCCSS virtual lecture. So I hope you guys all enjoy it, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to start to talk about the origins of human movement and how we evolved to move. So how this came about is Dr. Howitt, who's a close personal friend of mine as well as a colleague, he asked me to speak at this conference, and I said, well, I don't really have anything per se that's an hour long that I can speak of, but I do have concepts, of course, that I've dived into quite deeply over the years, myself as well as Dr. Chivers, who's speaking later, as well as some other people, in the creation of what we call the functional range systems. And I mean, I best we can best summarize the functional range systems as just what we think we should be doing with other homo sapiens. I mean, that's generally what these systems are. And the way these systems were created is by doing very deep dives on a number of topics. And what I want to do today is I want to take you guys on a deep dive on one of the branches that led to the creation of the system that we put in place. So Dr. Howitt kind of said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, I don't really have any one particular topic. So what do you want me to talk about? And he said, talk about movement. And then I said, what about movement? He said, talk about anything and everything. So I decided to go with everything because anything seemed a little bit random. And what I mean by everything is I want to try to paint the picture of a unified theory of human movement. And the reason I do that is because the deeper we go down into the topic like this, the more we start to understand whether or not what we're doing is actually going to be effective. At least it was that way for me. So really, I'm going to start to talk about how human movements are created, because I firmly believe that if we understand how they're created, we'll be better able to know when to interject in order to change those movements beneficially. So my title slide here, you guys might recognize from Darwin's The Origin of Species, probably the most influential book in the history of the world, in my opinion. And as you can see, I made some changes. So where Darwin was talking about evolution at the level of the species, I want to bring the evolution down to the level of the creation of motion, because the evolutionary process, or the natural selective process, is indeed how we select for the movements that we select for. So starting with the title page, instead of the origin of species, we're going to call this the origin of human movement by means of natural selection. And instead of saying the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, we're going to say the preservation for neural pathways in the struggle for efficiency, because that's my conclusion as to how movements are made. They are naturally selected for based on the efficiency of the movements. I'm going to do something a little bit different, and what I'm about to present, of course, in our profession, I always say this, what we present is an interpretation that we have of the scientific literature. The cool thing about our profession, and by our profession, I mean chiropractors and trainers, whoever takes care of other Homo sapiens, the cool thing about our profession is that the literature, we can all interpret it slightly differently. And of course, everyone's going to interpret it slightly differently based on their backgrounds. But what I'm going to give you today is my interpretation of one area that I think is really, really important to study, which is how human movements are created. And I'm going to do something a little bit differently here because I know I'm going to go over on time. I actually want to start with my conclusions. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but the reason I want to do this is because oftentimes during a presentation, you're building up to some conclusion. And by the time you get to it, you often forget about all of the deep dive work that you went in to come to that conclusion. So I figure if I give you the conclusions now, then even if I don't get to it later, you'll kind of understand during my discussion why I'm talking about this. Because I'll warn you now, there's a lot of topics I'm going to talk about that you guys are going to have no idea initially why this is part of a sport chiropractic conference. But I assure you that it will help. At least it helped me to understand how to deal with Homo sapiens. So let's start with the conclusions. The major conclusion I'm going to make is this. In the sum of the parts, there's only the parts. And that's a quote by Wallace Stevens. And I'm riffing off a quote by Aristotle that a lot of people overuse. And the quote by Aristotle that I feel is overused or not used properly is, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. People are actually misquoting Aristotle into thinking that he was saying that the parts actually magically create a whole that has nothing to do with what is going on with those individual parts. But in reality, Aristotle was talking about the concept of emergence. And what he was trying to say is that the whole is only a sum of the parts, meaning that the parts are what create the whole. That's what Wallace Stevens meant when he said in the sum of the parts is only the parts. Why is this important to me? I think it's important because I think, as a profession, therapists, trainers, we have a tendency of clumping movements together and using words like kinetic chain and using words like neutral spine and telling people this joint should be used for dynamic purposes and this joint be used for stability. And we move with our shoulder and our hip have to work together in coherence. But realistically, if your right shoulder doesn't work well and your left shoulder doesn't work well, they're not going to work well together. And that's why I say in the sum of the parts, and there's only the parts, because the only access that we have to helping how people move are to help their movable bits. All movements are just accumulations of smaller movements by individual joints that accumulate into the bigger movement. And I think far too often we're analyzing the bigger movements and watching people run and deciding if exercises are functional, but we're not giving enough attention to what the body actually is able to do. So that brings me to my next conclusion, which is the conclusion that movement is medicine. And I'm not going to say that that's a bad conclusion. It's absolutely true. But I think it's an incomplete conclusion and it provides incomplete advice because movement in general is not medicine. Specific movement into specific articulations maintains the health of those joints specifically. So I think we have to be very careful when we say movement is medicine. When we say, get up in the morning and just flow around and experiment and find your body parts and pretend you're a downward dog or whatever we're doing. Not to say that those things aren't good, but I think it's incomplete advice because if your shoulder doesn't move, it doesn't matter what exercise you decide to do or what the exercise is called. If your shoulder doesn't function like a human shoulder should, it sure as heck will not function as a human shoulder should during the shoulder exercise. So we have to be very specific with what we mean when we say movement is medicine. Another conclusion is that we don't take into account, I believe, the word prerequisites enough and the idea that we can't move where we can't move. What do I mean by that? Again, when we're talking about exercise, there's this thing to fall into this idea of functionality. This movement's functional, that movement's not functional. A Turkish get-up is functional, a bicep curl is more functional. I don't know about you guys today, but I know that I did not get out of bed this morning like a Turkish person. So to say that a Turkish get-up is functional, I don't really understand that. What I do know is that some people don't have the joint capacities to do Turkish get-ups, in which case that exercise probably is the worst exercise for them. So a conclusion that I've noticed is that I think we have to really pay more attention to the prerequisites of motion, and we have to use more of our time training to acquire those prerequisites, and a little bit less time training the patternized movements that emerge based on the functionality of those joints. Which brings me to my next point, that if you want articular interdependence, you first need articular independence. It doesn't matter to me that the spine works with the hip in some amazing neurological way. That's awesome. But I know that if you don't have a segmenting spine, that spine really has no way of telling the brain where it is in three-dimensional space. So if you're walking around in neutral spine for your entire life and you don't actually put movement into the L5S1, your brain will quite honestly forget that you have an L5S1, and there's consequences. And you can't ask a spine that doesn't have an L5S1 to do squats because it's important for squatting. You can't ask someone to squat if they have no hips, because having a hip is more functional than having the squat. Another conclusion I want to make is that movements, as we know now by dynamic systems theory, movements are not stored. Movements are pruned and learned from afferents. Afferents is the filters that we use to learn movements with. So movement and the learning of movement is actually a natural selective process based on afferents, such that the body organizes, monetizes itself, and maintains itself via afferents. Another conclusion I'm going to make is that the body really sees itself from the inside out. The organization of the body sees itself from deep inside the body of the joints, and then it sees its way outward. And I believe that we have to start to reflect our assessments, reflect our training, and reflect our treatments in a way that we are also looking from the body inside out, and we are approaching the body from the inside out. And I will bring up the word workspace because that's going to come up a lot in my presentation. Just realize I have a lot of conclusions. Here's another one. Anatomical bioflow, which is what I call the meat wagon that surrounds your nervous system, the stuff that makes up your body. I don't really like to think of muscles and then joints and then ligaments, but a continuation of articular flow, or tissue flow. And it's that tissue flow that creates afferents. And I want to remind that to people. Afferents is created by mechanoreceptors, and mechanoreceptors are just slightly altered normal tissues. All tissues undergo entropy, which is the gradual breakdown into disorder. And therefore, if we're not maintaining the tissues that provide the afferents on an ongoing basis, we are losing afferents, which means our body is losing track of where it is in three-dimensional space. Without quality, clean tissue afferents, we are less able to shape our action maps in our cortex. And without our action maps, we don't have a good way of executing movements. Thus, your pruning mechanism, the afferents, because it's made of your stuff, which is your tissues, your afferents is dependent on the quality of your stuff. And that is ongoing. You continuously learn how to move throughout your life. The brain is plastic, and the filters you use to learn with is your stuff. Your stuff is what's sending information to your brain, your tissues, your capsules. So the maintenance of the specific stuff, in my opinion, is more important than the maintenance of the patterns. So I believe that we should be moving into a tissue-specific training concept and a little bit further away from a pattern-specific training concept. The movements that we make are variable. We don't do them the same every time. So when you have a coach that's confining the variables and saying squat like this only, and your feet must be here and they must be turned out to 30 degrees, and you must come down with your knees over your toes. What we're doing is we're confining movement variables, and we're hammering the same line of tissue over and over and over. And if you hammer the same line of tissue cannot adapt indefinitely. So you will either accommodate or that tissue will end up exploding under the overforce, if that makes sense. So another conclusion is that based on that concept that our tissue is producing afferents, the capsule, which is the deepest tissue surrounding the joints, the capsular information is the first information to reach the central nervous system once your joint has been initiated during a movement. And therefore, if the capsule information is bad, likely the resultant movement is not going to be optimal. That's why I'm going to conclude that workspace, or the preservation of space, should be the most important outcome measure that is utilized by anyone who cares about how people move. And by maintaining healthy joints with high degrees of freedom, with clean afferents, we can help people to ongoingly select for more efficient, complex, and adaptable human movements. So the major conclusion that I've said many, many times over the years is force is the language of cells and movement is what we say. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to start to explain how movement is a natural selective process. And by what I mean by that is movements arise, and they arise by creating what we call self-organization, or otherwise known as spontaneous order. So I'm going to read this slide. It's not a very nice slide. There's a lot of information. I promise not to read any more slides, but I'll read this one. So self-organization or spontaneous order is a process where some form of order arises from the local interactions, joints, between parts of an initially disordered system. And really, when we talk about the natural evolution of a human body, of the anatomy of the human body and how we move, what we're talking about is the creation of spontaneous order from disorder. Spontaneous order can occur if sufficient energy is available, meaning there's no need for an external agent to create spontaneous order. As long as there's sufficient energy and that energy is bounded or contained, you will be able to take an unordered system and order it. That ordering will be amplified by a positive feedback loop. So if this system, this dynamic system, has positive feedback as it's being ordered, it will happen more efficiently. And I just spoke to you about afference as being the positive feedback loop used by our joints in the efficient natural selection of human movement. Also, the organization of a self-organized system is decentralized. I said that in the sum of the parts, there's only the parts. So the organization is distributed over all of the components of the system. The systems of self-organized are also robust, and they also can undergo self-repair, just like the human body. So what I'm going to argue is that the human body is just a system that self-organized itself. And by self-organizing, we have a system where all of the energy can be contained, and because it can be contained, the energy can be organized into something greater than the sum of the parts. Now, in order to tackle this topic, over the years, I've always said that if you want to understand something deeply, you want to look at it from several different lenses. And I realized that in this room was a lot of doctors and trainers who have taken the biological approach to thinking about things. And the biological approach tells us a lot. However, I always say that our biology is created by our chemistry, and our chemistry is governed by the natural laws of the physical universe. So we can say that biology is made by chemistry, which is governed by physics. Now, I know that everyone has thought about the human movement and such in the biological realm, but I want to think about it from the perspective of physics, because I believe that if we can make sense of what we're doing from the laws of the physical universe, it only strengthens our arguments as to what we decide to do biologically. And that's why if you've ever seen my feeds or whatever, you'll notice that I have these three pictures in my training room. And they're to remind me to think about things amongst these lenses. The first one is, of course, the cover of The Origin of Species, denoting biology. The second is the periodic table of elements, denoting chemistry. And the third is the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is pretty much the electromagnetic remnants of the Big Bang in the early universe, to denote physics. So as I said, I'm going to look at this problem from the lens, starting off at least, the lens of physics. And I want to ask, what do the laws of the physical universe say regarding Homo sapien fitness? We can explain fitness biologically, but can we explain what fitness means through the eyes of the physical universe? So Darwin, of course, everyone knows, really took a biological approach when he was coming up with Darwinian evolution, which is a theory of biological evolution stating that all species arise from and develop from natural selection of small inherited variations that increase an individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. Again, a very good lens, but I want to look at it from a slightly different perspective. How about if we consider Darwinian evolution not from the lens of biology, but from the lens of physics? And in so doing, can we somehow create a concept not of biological fitness, but of molecular fitness that underlies that biological process? Because if we can find that, we will better be able to conclude that what we're doing at a biological level has a foundation of being right, if that makes sense. So what I want to get at is there somehow a goal of the universe? Does the universe have a goal in mind? And it turns out there's a lot of smart people thinking about this question. And I'm going to draw on some of the work of those smart people. For example, Ilya Prigogine, who's a physical chemist and a Nobel laureate, very important in the development of chaos theory. Jeremy England, who is a physicist, a professor of physics and biophysics at MIT. and Frank Lambert, who's a chemical professor at, or he was at Occidental College. So I'm going to draw a lot on their work, and I advise you, of course, to look at their work. But when you consider their work together, what you realize is that they kind of provide a reason for the universe to be here, so to speak. And in so providing that reason, you can also extrapolate a good reason why life would spontaneously evolve. So if you consider life in these terms, we can speculate a reason for life through the eyes of physics. And the reason for life through the eyes of physics, or at least what it really seems to be, at least it's very important, is to create entropy. If you were to say, what is the purpose of this universe? What is it trying to do? The one thing that for sure universally we know it's trying to do is it's trying to dissipate heat energy. From the early Big Bang until now, energy has been spreading out over the rapidly expanding universe as time expands, and that seems to be one of the main goals of the physical universe. So let's talk about entropy in this goal. Entropy is a thermodynamic quantity, representing the unavailability of a system's thermal energy for conversion into mechanical work, often interpreted as a degree of disorder or randomness in a system. It's also sometimes discussed as a gradual decline from order to disorder. So any dynamic system like a human starts from an order and then it gradually decays into disorder. And that's the concept of entropy as it loses heat. Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington actually referred to entropy as the arrow of time, meaning that as time goes on, based on the second law of thermodynamics, all complex structures will decline into disorder with time. So my question now is, because we see examples in the universe of things creating order, for example, a plant, you see a plant starts to grow up, but a plant really doesn't grow back down. It grows up, meaning that it kind of takes energy and creates order to the energy. A rabbit, a human, clearly those things are able to take energy and create order. So the question is, how are we able to circumvent, so to speak, the universal goal of preventing disorder? Another way you can think of this is, how are we able to steal time in order to take disordered system and create pockets of order? And that's really what I want to talk about. And to highlight that, I'm going to reference Jeremy England again, who discussed something called dissipation-driven adaptation. And I'm going to read what the definition of that is. Dissipation-driven adaptation is that random groups of molecules can self-organize and more efficiently absorb and dissipate heat from the environment. So his hypothesis states that such self-organizing systems are an inherent part of the physical world. Now, what that means is the world wants to create entropy and it wants to disorder and it wants to spread out heat energy. However, there are scenarios where you can take disorder and create order. However, as per this theory, the only way you can create order is if the order you create subsequently leads to more entropy. Does that make sense to everyone? So if you have any molecules and you give it sufficient energy, the molecules can organize themselves, but only if the organization, the resulting organization, results in more heat dissipation. Now, for life, that's a great way to explain life, right? Because life is a great way to absorb energy from the universe and convert that energy into work. How? By creating movement, which creates heat. So if the universal goal is entropy, life can be thought of as a tool to create energy or to create heat dissipation or to create entropy. So really, we're doing the job of the physical universe. There's other examples of this that you can see all over the place. For example, if two weather systems are coming and they clash into each other and there's an accumulation of too much energy, the universe will create a tornado in order to disperse the energy. If sunlight bombards a planet for long enough and there's a lot of energy pocketing in a particular area of the planet, a good way to dissipate that energy is to grow a plant. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is that life seems to be a great tool for creating energy, or for creating entropy. So then we can think of training or adaptations as this process of creating order. But again, the order that we create, we can only create the order if subsequently we can provide more heat energy to the universe. So when we train and we get stronger, These adaptations are rewards given to you by the physical universe because you're putting work into improving the tool whose job it is to create heat. I'm getting excited. So we can also say that the law of progressive adaptation, which all of us in the audience understands inherently from what we do, it is the law of thermodynamics. It is the same law. We are building energy dissipators, which aligns our goals with that of the fabric of the universe itself. So we have this universal goal now, and the universal goal is to create entropy or to dissipate heat. Before, if you were at my lecture, last time I lectured for the RCCSS, I talked a lot about why we were naturally selected to do, and I talked a lot about the fact that, what we were naturally selected to do, and I talked a lot about the fact that we were really naturally selected to be hunter-gatherers. If you look at the genome of a Homo sapien, the vast majority of our existence, we existed as hunter-gatherers, which means our genome was literally forged for us to be successful hunter-gatherers. So we've already discussed what we were naturally selected to do. But now I want to change the question, and I want to ask ourselves why we were naturally selected to do instead of what. And I just kind of gave you the answer. Why we were naturally selected is because we can create heat. And how do we create heat? We create heat through creating human movement. So my first major conclusion now is that movement creates heat. So the universal goal is to create entropy, and that entropy is provided for by living structures like ourselves by creating movement, which subsequently produces heat. So why then are we created? If we're created to produce heat, why were we naturally selected as we were? Well, the reason we were naturally selected, again, is to create heat to pay back the physical universe. A way to explain this, I'm going to quote Daniel Wolpert, who's a professor of neurobiology at Columbia University. And Daniel Wolpert is quoted as saying, we have brains or a brain for only one reason, and that is to produce adaptable and complex human movements. We have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that's to produce adaptable and complex human movements. I'm sorry, it wasn't for Shakespeare. It wasn't for anything but that purpose. And the reason we know that to be true is because movement is the only way that we have of affecting the world around us, apart from sweating, which is also the release of heat. But other than that, the only way that we can have an effect on the outside world to create the heat that the universe so desires is to move. There is no other way. So we can conclude that the only reason we have a brain is to produce complex and adaptable movements. Now, you might then think that because I said the only reason we have a brain is to produce movements, you might conclude then that a large part of the human brain is taken up by the creation and control of human movement. And you would be absolutely correct in saying so. Space, or an understanding of space and how we move through space, and space is multimodal, but space in all of its forms occupies approximately half of our cortex. And if you look at the human brain from an evolutionary standpoint, you'll see layers of the brain, whereby the deepest brain, which is the oldest evolved portion of the brain, our reptilian brain comes first. Then we have a limbic brain that grew around that. And then we have a cortical brain with a neocortex that allows us to like ice cream and hate liver and like our wife sometime and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have our deepest brain, then we have brains that kind of grew on top of them through an evolutionary process. Now, if we think backwards in time, though, people were thinking and objects were thinking and things were thinking long before we had voluntary consciousness. In other words, before we had language, before we had numbers, before we had all of these complex things, we were able to think because that's how we affected the world around us. And what that means is movement had to have its own logic. And what it also means is that movement actually forms the foundation for human thought. Movement and movement through space is the foundation of thinking. I would argue that without movement, there is no relevance for human thought specifically. And I will strengthen that argument by quoting Sam Harris, who's noted that intelligence only matters because you can do something with it to affect your survival. When you think about that, it's not a hard thing to understand. When you're thinking about, let's think of words themselves. I often ask my wife, who speaks French, she's fluent in French, I go, what language are you thinking in? But then I stop and think, what a stupid question, because she doesn't think in language, you think in thoughts. Even words themselves, or sorry, you think in movement. Even words themselves are movements. Think of the word word. What is the word word? The word word means that I moved my vocal cords at a very specific angle, and then I pushed air via my diaphragm through these vocal cords, and I made a sound. Word, word. But it's not a thing, it's a movement. Think of the number 7 or numbers in general. There are no numbers. There is no number 7. Number 7 is a construct that we use to be able to maneuver through our physical space. There is no number 7. The number 7 is just something that we can use to denote that there's 7 things that might be in our way, et cetera, et cetera. So at the foundation of human thinking is movement. And it's not my idea. This, if you want to read more on this, please read the work of Barbara Tversky, and she will explain that a lot more. She's a cognitive psychologist who really has laid down the foundation for this thought process of movement being the foundation of thinking. And what she notes is that space places 2 fundamental constraints on movements. And those constraints are reflected in the way we think. Those 2 constraints are simply proximity. Things that are near are easier to get to than things that are far, and gravity. Going up is more effortful than going down. So when I take this coffee cup here and I want to go and take a sip of coffee, I don't look at the coffee cup and I say, coffee, C-O-F-F-E-E, cup, flex arm now, get cup, drink coffee. No, I look at the coffee cup. I define it in 3-dimensional space because I think in space. I look at the edges, and I look at the edges relative to the background. That helps me denote the distance. And then there's only 2 things that I have to overcome. How far is it away from me, and how much energy do I need to expend? And then I get to take my drink of coffee without ever having to consider anything other than those 2 constraints. So we can actually conclude very strongly that movement creates thought. So now we have the universal goal, which is to create entropy. We have a means by which to do it because our nervous system was only really created to create movement, which subsequently produces heat. And now we have the idea that all of our thoughts, and I'm not talking here about conscious thoughts because the vast majority of our thoughts are subconscious and they're not under any type of free will. But for the most part, movement is what creates the foundation for human thought. Now, we have a goal, we have a universal goal, we have a biological goal to create complex adaptable movements. We have a mechanism, so to speak, for thinking. Now I want to talk about what motivates us to move. So why do we decide to move into the environment? Because that's also a very important thing to have if we want to create this spontaneous order of human movement. So in order to explain this concept, I'm going to draw from the work of Daniel Lieberman and Long. Daniel Lieberman is by far one of my favorite authors on the topic of evolutionary biology. And I'm going to take you through how they explain the motivation for almost anything, but specifically regarding human movement. So I want everyone in the audience, if you don't mind, I want you to right now, whatever you're doing, I just want you to look up into your environment. I want you to look up and I want you to take a look around the room. Then I want you to look down. And I want you to look down at the immediate area, which is you're able to touch and feel with your hands. It just so happens that the brain is developed in a way that we have a competing system that governs what we do in the environment in our immediate area versus what we do in our external environment. And the way those are defined, Lieberman would call the space in our immediate area our peripersonal space. Again, the spaces where we can pick things up and enjoy them and touch them in our workspace. And then when we look up and we see our environment, the land of opportunity, he considers that our extrapersonal space. So we have peripersonal space, extrapersonal space. I'm going to develop a few more concepts on top of this. In our peripersonal space, the things we have to move and manipulate things with are our capsular workspaces, which means the spaces we have in our capsules, and our articular workspaces, which is the amount of movement we can create using that capsular space to affect our outside environment. So we can call this articular workspace and capsular workspace in our peripersonal space. And when we look up into our extrapersonal space, we can call this our global workspace. please do look up Bernard Barr's and global workspace theory. I have no time to discuss it now, but for our purposes now, global workspace is our land of opportunity. We have competing chemicals that govern our peripersonal space and our extrapersonal space. Our peripersonal space is governed by things that we call here and now neurotransmitters, including serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, endocannabinoids, which you get from smoking a joint, by the way, for all the Canadians in the audience. Our here and now neurotransmitters control our peripersonal space because they allow us to enjoy and experience all of the things that we have in our immediate area. As we do enjoy these things, our here and now neurotransmitters rise. However, when we look up into the environment, if we just imagine, if we just stayed in our environment right now as it is, if we just stayed in our environment, I just spilled coffee all over my computer. Give me 1 second here. Much better. If we simply stay in the environment that's given to us, we would never ever affect the outside world. And if we couldn't affect the outside world, we would end up dying. We would enjoy ourselves immensely, but we wouldn't be able to acquire food or anything else that we need. So when we look up into the extrapersonal space, another chemical starts to rise, and that chemical is called dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical of motivation. That is what forces us to go out into our external environment and forces us to explore and acquire things that we're going to need. I'm going to point out the dopaminergic pathways here. I know we've probably all studied these dopaminergic pathways, but I think it's important to remember just how vast the dopaminergic pathways are. And the fact that these dopaminergic pathways, they have effect on every single part of the brain, working from our oldest, deepest brain right into our neocortex. And I'm going to specifically draw your attention to the nigrostriatal path. The nigrostriatal path, which is indicated here in orange, that's coming from a substantia nigra, and it's going to our caudate and our putamen. And you'll remember from neuroanatomy that creates what is known as our basal ganglion motor loop, which means that that loop is really what controls voluntary and non-voluntary human movement. So the conclusion that I want to get from this little section right now is that chemistry is what motivates movement. So now we have a universal goal, create heat and dissipate heat and create entropy. We have a means to do it, which means we have a biological goal for our nervous system, which is to create complex and adaptable human movements. We have a basis for thought, which is movement. And now we can say that our movements are motivated by chemistry. So you see what I'm doing? I'm trying to build some kind of a confine so I can take energy and keep it within the system to create spontaneous order. I promise you I'm getting to the point of this, guys, so just stick with me. So chemistry motivates movement. Now, what do we need next? If we have our motivator, we have our universal goal, we have our biological goal, we have our foundation for thought, we know that thought is motivated by chemistry. What do we need now to actually produce movements? Well, what we need is space. Space is the canvas on which the nervous system is able to execute its biological purpose, which is to create complex and adaptable human movements. So now we have to talk about how we create space. And to talk about that, I'm going to bring you back into embryology. Back into embryology, if we go back, of course, one cell meets another cell, those cells start to divide, those cells create a morula, those cells then later divide into somites, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go over all of biology, but I will take you back to week 3. And at week 3 is where we have a differentiation of the primary germ layers. You'll recall the primary germ layers as being the endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm. I'm going to focus in on 2 of them, the ectoderm and the mesoderm. The ectoderm, because the ectoderm is really what drives our neurological, our biological purpose. Our ectoderm will later form our nervous system, which is how we create complex and adaptable movements. Our mesoderm is what's going to create our stuff, our meat wagon, our skeletal system, our muscles, our fascia, etc. The reason I want to point this out is I want to remind you that all of this stuff came from the same glob of cells. The same glob of cells had to somehow differentiate. Now, if we put the ectoderm as being the most important thing for driving our biological purpose, we can think of the mesoderm, the meat, as growing off of the ectoderm. And that's exactly what it's doing. The mesoderm is the cilia that your ectoderm uses to learn about its environment, because there's no way for a brain to know about its environment if not for information coming in and information coming up. And the information coming up is being generated by our meat. There's an intimate relation such that the myelin that is located on the nerves is actually created from mesoderm, almost to keep a very close proximity. So I wanted to point out the fact that these layers grow off of one another, and we should really consider the mesoderm being grown off of the ectoderm. Now, based on that, how is space made? We're at the 3 weeks, we have these 3 germ layers, and now we have to decide where our joints going to go. And I assure you, this, you might think this is an easy understanding, but this took years of research and thinking to really understand why things are put where they're put. Why don't we have an arm that grows out of our head? Why is my shoulder here instead of here? Why is my hip here? There is a reason, and the reason has to do with what we call body plans. All living structures, all living things have a body plan. And what a body plan is just rough information given by our genome. It's an area of our genome that codes for what we call morphogens. Morphogens are proteins that are made from our genome, and the morphogens are created and sent out into the growing clump of cells, but it's not sent out at the same amount. So in other words, a lot of a certain type of morphogen might go over here, and a less amount of that morphogen might go over here, but a lot of a different morphogen might go into another area. So what we call this is morphogen gradients, okay? So a body plan has a genome piece of the genome, which creates morphogens. These morphogens are spread out into the cells, and we create a morphogen gradient, which creates a fluid force on the cells. This is the first time I'm going to say that force is the language of cells. It's the fluid force from this morphogen gradients that occur that actually lead to durotaxis, which is an attraction of cells into a particular area where force exists. So you have this morphogen gradients, you have these cells starting to clump together around these gradients. These cells are then going to start to actually contract and condense on themselves. This is what's called mesenchymal condensation, where the mesenchyme will start to condense on itself. And then once the mesenchyme condenses on itself, it's going to form what is here in C, it's going to form an interzone where we have this condensation of cells, which is going to be specifically in the area we want joints to be. Now, as this mesenchymal condensation continues, once the pressure gets so high, what's going to happen is there's going to be a cavitation. See, I'm talking to chiropractors. There's going to be a cavitation where a space is going to form in the middle of all of these cells. And that space is therefore then going to go on to make our joints. But are the joints in our anatomy, is that coded for? No, just the space. Because after the space is made, at around 14 weeks, muscle proteins start to get developed. And muscle proteins start to twitch. And based on those twitches, that is going to lead to the morphogenesis of your joints. In other words, your joint is being carved, honed, shaped, and subsequently later maintained by human movement, because force is the language of cells and movement is what we say. So to conclude what I just said there, movement is what creates the space. Later, movement is what maintains the space, because we all know that movement is really the only thing that can preserve the ongoing health of an articulation. You guys can inject glucosamine, fish oils into your joints. No matter what you do, if you're not moving your joint, it's not going to stay healthy in time. So we can say that movement creates space, movement maintains space, and space governs movement, because space really provides the landscape for us to move into. So I believe space to be the ultimate prerequisite measure of movement potential, because space represents degrees of freedom that our body is allowed to move into. And via moving into these degrees of freedom, that is how we're ultimately going to create the heat that the universe so desperately wants. So space is really the canvas or the fabric that the nervous system uses to execute its biological purpose, which is to create complex, adaptable human movements. Movement regulates the creation of space, and then movement regulates the ongoing preservation of that space. In our system, my system, Dr. Chivers, who's going to speak next, in the functional range system, we actually have a rule to govern everything we do, from training to treatment to assessment, and that is workspace over everything. Your body decides how to set spindle tones. Your body decides which muscles should remain tight, should remain based on that space. And I'm going to explain that in the next section. And what that tells us is we should be spending way more time caring about the quality of our workspaces than about the patterning of exercises that we deem to be functional. It's the preservation of space and the preservation of degrees of freedom that allows us the expansion of time, or to slightly circumvent entropy and take a disorder and create a spontaneous bit of order, which is a living creature. Now, this is space, okay? As you can see, if space has no boundaries, then it's really not useful for the nervous system to understand how to move within the space. There needs to be a boundary so that the nervous system can understand how the space is and what the space is doing. How is that boundary made in a human body? Everyone look at the screen. It's made by that. It's made by creating a capsule. A capsule is not a something. It's just the deepest layer of bioflow tissue closest to the space. But because it's the deepest layer of tissue closest to the space, the mechanoreceptors that live within the tissue that make the capsule, as soon as movement is initiated, it is that signal that will be the first signal to feed back to the central nervous system, telling it how the movement is going. Ergo, if there's something wrong with your capsule or the capsular space, you're going to have a really hard time teaching an athlete how to move better. The capsule denotes the space. It governs the space. The capsule itself dictates the space, so to speak, because it is what sends back information to the central nervous system to tell it how the space is doing. So you have the capsule dictating the space. You have the cavity, the synovium, the synovial fluid, the cartilage, the innervation, all within the space. And this space is a dynamic organ system, which, by the way, is privy to entropy. So when someone comes in, what exercise are we going to do today? We're going to do the bench press. We're going to do a linear motion. That linear motion is not going to be effective in stimulating all of the mechanoreceptors in your capsule. That's why we created controlled articular rotations as a way to continuously stimulate capsular tissue to ensure that we are constantly warding off entropy, such that the mechanoreceptors remain healthy, such that the feedback mechanism to our central nervous system produces clean and effective afferents, such that we can select for better human movement. Now, why is the capsular information so important? Let's go over in basic neuroanatomy 101. When information comes from, let's say from a muscle spindle or from skin, the information is going to come via afferent paths, and it's going to come into the dorsal root horn. At the dorsal root horn, there's a decision-making process. And I say decision-making process, and I mean it. If you don't understand what I mean, please look up Seth Grant and look up the concept of synaptome architecture to convince yourself that there is logic and intelligence even in neuronal connections apart from the brain. We have no time for that today, but I will say that most afferent information, when it comes into the dorsal root horn, a decision is made. Should I kick this up to the central nervous system, to the brain? Or do we have a reflex at the spinal cord level that I can use to deal with this problem? So it goes into the dorsal root horn, a decision made, and then that neuron synapses with what's called an interneuron, which will then synapse either on a path going up the spine or a path going out the ventral horn to try to deal with the problem. Because there's an interneuron, there is a time delay. It's a very small delay, but there is indeed a time delay where the decision has to be made. Where is there no time delay? There is no time delay coming from type 2 mechanoreceptors, which are low threshold, rapidly adapting mechanoreceptors. And guess where there's a lot of type 2 mechanoreceptors? In the deepest portion of the capsule. There's 4 types of mechanoreceptors. Type 1 is superficial, in the superficial capsule. Type 2 is in the deep capsule. Type 3 is in what we call capsular thickenings, popularly known as ligaments. And type 4 are pain mechanoreceptors. The information coming from the type 2 receptors, a lot of which are located in the deep capsule, which gets the signal of movement first, they have what we call direct cortical representation, whereby information from those mechanoreceptors bypasses the dorsal root horn, does not have an interneuron delay, and makes it directly up to the thalamus, where the information gets relayed into all of the areas of the cortex which are there to control human movement. Premotor cortex, motor cortex, supplementary sensory area, sensory cortex, cerebellum, all controlling human movement. Think about it. Why does the brain want the information specifically from the capsule, and why does it want it first? Because preservation of the capsule is the outcome measure that governs all motor outputs. Someone has a tight back, you go and rub the back feels better. 2 days later, the back tightens up. Of course it tightens up, because the space has to be examined. If that space isn't providing good, clean afferents, it will send information to the nervous system saying, tighten up, something's wrong. Then we get tight muscles. Again, I'm trying to point out that we got to think way deeper when we're thinking about how to affect human movement. So the primary outcome measure for musculoskeletal output, thus, is the preservation of space. And I will point out again, the preservation of space is defined afferently by the capsule. The capsule is created by bioflow tissue, and is that tissue that provides the mechanoreception that lets the brain know what is going on in three-dimensional space. And why I'm bringing this up is because, again, I think that we are spending far too much time with pretty displays of movements and snatches and cleans and all of this stuff, and we're not thinking enough about the quality of our clients' afferents. By the way, the quality of the afferents has to be maintained. When was the last time people in the audience did, let's say, really hard rotational work for their rotator cuff? We do a lot of that work, which would be capsular specific, when we're injured. If somebody injures themselves, often we go to deep rotational work in order to rehab, and then we go right back to linear training. Let's do the bench press, let's do the squat, let's do lateral raises. And then we forget that entropy is killing our mechanoreceptors day by day until something goes wrong. I think we really have to focus more on the afferents coming from these capsules. And another thing that I'm going to conclude here is that it's movement that creates that afference, and it's afference that then begets motor learning. So if we were to review again, we have a goal for the universe, which is to create entropy or to dissipate heat. We have a biological purpose, which is to create movement, complex adaptable movements, which then creates heat. We have a motivating system, being chemistry, which motivates thoughts, and we have thought, which really is only created by human movement, and we have that movement that feeds back afferents. So what I've really been trying to paint for you guys is a picture as to how life confines energy in order to create order. In order to create order from energy, we need to have what we call boundary conditions, and that's what's described by Stuart Kaufman. And these boundary conditions will contain the energy such that the energy can be organized. So right here, I'm giving you kind of that contained energy explanation, and I'm going to come back to it in 1 second, and we're going to explain it a little bit more. What I want to talk about now is I really want to focus again on these landscapes of movement. So once again, we have our capsular space, which is made embryologically. Based on that capsular space, it's movement which will then start to mold that capsular space. Based on that capsular space, we have the ability, or we have a landscape to move with. If we look into our environment, we have what we call a global workspace. So I've just described number 1 and number 3. Capsular space made as we're embryo. Global workspace is the environment we're allowed to work into. And then we have number 2, which is our articular workspace. Our articular workspace denotes where we are able to produce work. And I remind you that the only way that we can create heat is to create movement, and the only way to create movement is to be able to create work. So our articular workspace denotes all areas that we are able to create work. It's our articular workspace which is going to shape our action maps, because the capsular workspace and the articular workspace, these aren't real things. These exist in our brain. Why? Because our brain doesn't know what's going on. Our brain is very secluded. It's underneath ½ an inch of hard bone. We have no way of accessing in. It has no way of accessing out other than the information coming in and the information coming up. Nick Winkelman's going to speak in a little bit later about the information coming in and how you can hone that information. I'm here talking about the information coming up, and the information coming up is of vital importance because the information coming up, the afferents, is the filters that we use ongoing to learn, modify, and maintain human movement. That's why we created CARs. Controlled articular rotations are an exploration of our workspace. Why do we do them? Because if you don't use tissue, if you're not using any of your tissues go away. If your tissues really are either organizing energy to create order, or they're degrading under the ongoing pressure of entropy. So we have to use these tissues. If we're not using our workspace in its entirety, the mechanoreceptors that govern the area back here, if you haven't activated them in 10, 20, 30 years, they're not there anymore. The brain will literally forget that you have this area, and it'll be reflected when you watch someone do their controlled articular rotations, because instead of giving you a very nice, clean articular workspace, they're going to start to bleed movements into other areas. And it's that bleeding of movement and the lack of prerequisites that leads to compensations, that leads to injury. So my main point here is that we have to be maintaining these workspaces on an ongoing basis. And if you want to assess a human being and what their potential is, there's no better way to assess the potential than to ask the joints, what are you able to do? And as far as I know, the only system that asks joints to repeatedly demonstrate what they're able to do, and the only system where people repeatedly analyze what joints are able to do, is CARs, controlled articular rotations. So again, movement creates afferents. Afferents shapes the cortical action maps in our brain, and those cortical action maps are defined by our workspaces. And ergo, the quality of our action maps are directly proportionate to the quality of the afferents, which is directly proportionate to the quality of the tissue, which is directly proportionate to the quality of the mechanotransduction that's feeding back to our central nervous system. So now I've given you all of the what we call, again, the boundary conditions, or what Stuart Coffert would call the boundary conditions that allow us to contain this energy and allow us to set a system in motion where we can use this system to naturally select for ongoing human movements. So what do we have here? We have the things that we have to overcome by thought, which is proximity and gravity. We have our motivation system, which is our chemistry. We have a universal goal of producing heat. We have a biological goal of producing motion in order to create heat. We have our landscapes, our capsular workspace, our articular workspace, and then our global workspace, which represents our environment. So what is the only missing ingredient we need to create human movement? We need an attractor. We need a reason to get motivated. We need some kind of driving reason for us to actually get off our lazy asses and move into the environment to create that heat. And what is the ultimate attraction for human movement? It's the concept of acquisition. The need for things, the need to acquire things, is the simplest of all human instincts, along with the conservation of energy. And is that desire to acquire things which drives the natural selection of human movements. If you look at a baby, when a baby's first born, they're just giving these flexion twitches and these extension twitches, and then they're tasked to learn about their environments. The motivating factor is the chemistry, but the attractor is to be able to acquire things. You need to acquire food, you need to acquire love, you need to acquire shelter, because if you don't, you will not be able to survive. So based on all of these boundary conditions, why are we so naturally selected to move? I come back to the original question. Where do we get the movements from? Why do movements exist the way that movements exist? So the first thing I will say is that movements are not stored. There is no little Dre sitting in Dre's brain at the helm of a computer with a bunch of programs ready to fire. So when Big Dre wants to squat, there is no little Dre in my consciousness looking through a list of programs and saying, you know, Turkish get up? No. Bicep curl? No. Squat. Oh, there's the squat. I'll take that in. I'll put it in, press enter. There is no center of consciousness. There is no movements that are stored. Movements are selected for on an ongoing basis based on efficiency. So using the primitive reflexes that we're given, flexion twitches, extension twitches, that starts the natural selective process whereby we're competing for the most efficient ways to make it towards our attractor state. So it's movement that drives motor learning. And motor learning is a process of microevolution or natural selection of efficient ways to move. So the patterns that we get don't live there. There is no squat. If you take a baby and you put it in a box and you do not allow any sensory information, there's not even the foundation for human thinking, let alone the foundation to create a squat. Squats are not coded for. We learn to squat based on efficiency. Now, to explain this, I'm really drive this home. I'm going to give the worst example I have ever given in my career. I am not asking anyone to do this. I am not condoning this in any way. It's just an example. Let's say that all of us in this conference went to the local hospital and we pumped, noxious gas through the hospital. Okay. The noxious gas only kills adults. Are you guys with me so far? Really? You shouldn't be with me. It's a horrible thing, but stay with me. I don't want you to do this, but just let's pretend. So we pump this gas through the hospital. All the adults are gone. So we're going to take all the babies from the neonatal unit. Oh, sounds good? Yes? Okay. So now we have all the babies and we're going to put the babies on a boat. We're not going to throw the babies. I'm not a monster. We're going to be nice. We're going to put the babies on a boat, very comfortable, everything. Then we're going to sail off and we're going to go to a secluded island. And then we're just going to, again, we're not going to throw them, but we're going to leave the babies on the island. And the only thing that we're going to leave for them is a stick with a pig's head on it. Nobody got that? Lord of the Flies? No? Okay, anyway. So we're going to leave a stick with a pig's head on it. We're going to leave the babies there and we're going to come back 10 years later. So we're going to come back 10 years later. And by some act of the sun god Ra, these babies survive. Okay? So now they're 10-year-olds. They're not babies anymore. Do you know what we're not going to find on that island? We're not going to find a bunch of crawling, butt-scooting babies. All of those babies, despite the fact that there were no movement coaches, there were no physiotherapists, there were none of us there, all of those babies will eventually figure out that the most efficient way to acquire things is to get up on 2 feet and run there. And they're going to do it not based on preconceived programs, but based on the fact that with the anatomy that you're given, the most efficient way for us to locomote is to get up and start walking. So movements are being pruned and they're being learned through the lens of your afferents. And therefore, your pruning and learning mechanism is dependent on the quality of your stuff. And I don't think that we spend enough time working on the quality of our stuff. I think we need to spend a lot more time doing tissue-specific training and less time doing pattern-specific training because the selection is ongoing. And I remember taking my kids to learn how to ski not too long ago, and I paid some guy to do it, and it was a stupid idea because all he did was put my kids at the top of my 6-year-old, at the top of the ski hill and said, lean forward and see how it goes. And my kid just leaned forward and skied all the way down. There was a couple next to us who was about 55 years old who was learning how to ski for the first time. 6 hours later, they could barely stand up. Why? Because my son has clean afferents and they do not. So articular training and maintenance of our articulation specifically must be our highest priority in order to maintain clean afferents, because afferents is how we learn how to move. And if we can maintain healthy joints with high degrees of freedom, we will be able to select for more efficient and more adaptable complex movements with patterns that are able to deal with more variables, because as we all know, we are a dynamic system under dynamic systems theory. And we got to get away from this idea of only patterning the same tissue over and over. So the moral of the story is if we want better movement capacity, we need cleaner filters. So I guess if we're going to go over all of this, we can summarize this by saying the universal goal of the universe seems to be to create entropy. Movement or heat. Movement creates heat. So the biological goal is to create complex and adaptable human movements. Movements also are the driving mechanism for thought, and the thoughts that we have are motivated by our chemistry. The space is created by movement, which is thereafter maintained by, the space is maintained by movement, and it's movement that creates the afference, which leads us to motor learning. So getting back to the conclusions, which I want to run through again, and I'm just going to highlight some of the most important parts. In the sum of the parts, there's only the parts. If your shoulder does not have the articular workspace to do overhead presses, then overhead presses are no longer functional. So just because you think that snatches are great, if you ask a person to show you their workspace and their shoulder flexion is coupled with a lot of back extension, then guess what you're going to be stressing when you put something over your head? You're going to be stressing something that is not your shoulder. And because shoulders were evolved from a natural selective process, you have to agree with me that there is something to be a shoulder that is not the same as being a hip or a knee. And therefore, we cannot allow compensations for shoulders. Movement is medicine if we're specific with it. We need to be very careful about putting specific movement into specific joints. Think of neutral spine, guys. Think of how we have everyone walking around not moving their spine at all and bending down and hinging at the hips all the time. I'm not saying neutral spine is a bad concept, but what I am saying is show me a way to maintain the health of a human articulation without movement. There is no way. So by telling people you must always move with the spine in this position, I don't think that's the smartest idea. Our tissue will not be able to send information to our brain to know where we are in space. So we want people to brace and we want people to be able to use their tissues. But if our brain doesn't know our tissues are there, then the brain's not going to be able to use the stuff that was evolved for them to control movements with. We have to be better on capturing prerequisites. And the only way I know how to capture prerequisites is detailed analysis of workspace, which is why we have controlled articular rotation. Articular interdependence cannot be assumed before articular independence. Movements are not stored, they're selected for based on afference. That afference is based on our tissue quality, which means that we should spend more time with tissue-specific training, which I know Dr. Chivers is going to elaborate on, versus patterns. Our body sees itself from the inside out, and we must remember that the outcome measure we use to move with is the preservation of that space. Capsular afference is the first thing to reach the central nervous system, and therefore we have to do a better job of creating, maintaining, and keeping healthy all of the tissues that provide our workspace. Because if we have healthy joints with high degrees of freedom, with clean afference, we will select for the most efficient and complex human movements available. How's my time? Okay, so I guess I can conclude there. I could go on for about 17 more hours, but I know that Dr. Chivers is going to elaborate on some of these topics, and then he's going to take it into another one of our tangents. So I'm looking forward to see how he does that. So I guess that's it for me, guys. I really do appreciate the time. I hope I didn't speak too quickly, but I did want to give you not just a bunch of research papers and results. I wanted to give you my thought process that really honed the way that I deal with the athletes that we deal with.